There's a pretty dramatic hush that came over the room all of a sudden. There was delicious laughter and conversation. Well, I'd like to welcome you to this extraordinarily exciting talk that we have been very much looking forward to. It also is one of our kickoff events for the 2018-2019 year for the Duke Islamic Studies Center. My name is Omid Safi. I have the honor of serving as a director of the center. And with that, I'm a little bit like the genie. Phenomenal cosmic power, living space. And part of that phenomenal cosmic power is that you get to survey the land and to think about who are the most extraordinary speakers that you would love to think with. And part of the joy of inviting Professor Morgenstein Fuerst to campus is there's some people who just kind of give you a talk, and it's a chance for them to sort of pat their own ego a little bit. And with Ilyse, it's always an opportunity to think together, to examine and scrutinize categories. And for about the last, I think, 17 years that I've had the pleasure of knowing her, I leave just about every single conversation feeling like I had to be a little bit smarter human being through this friendship and this dialogue. So let me tell you just a couple of things about Professor Morgenstein Fuerst. She specializes in religions of South Asia, is currently an assistant professor, but knock on wood, inshallah, soon to be an associate professor at the University of Vermont. And if not, there will be the mother of all protests that will break out with activists and academics all descending down upon Vermont. But that's not going to happen. So her research deals with Islam in South Asia, and how lovely that we get to have some lovely friends like Professor Bruce Lawrence, who's been reminding people in Islamic studies that, you know, half of all Muslims in the world live east of Karachi. So it wouldn't be lovely if half of the conversations that we have about Islam and Muslims in the world was centered somewhere east of Karachi. I had the extraordinary privilege of knowing a slightly younger version of Professor Morgenstein Fuerst, and for better and for worse, and in many ways, of course, for worse, if the world didn't change on September 11th, the academic field of Islamic studies certainly did. And even many of us who were trained as medievalists, I was trained in the social and intellectual history of 12th century, I found myself having to answer decidedly 21st century questions. And so in a way that would be a little weird if you're trained, let's say, in New Testament or patristics, and then all of a sudden you're answering every question about, I don't know, what's the most disastrous thing that could happen to contemporary Christianity, Jerry Falwell, or equally disastrous type of phenomena. That's actually sort of what happened to my field. And on the morning of September 11th, I was sitting in class with a not quite yet Professor Ilyse Morgenstein Fuerst. So our lives have been intertwined since then. She went on to study, yes, Islam, and also South Asian religions, and also Plato, because why not? Wrote a brilliant thesis, went off to this place called Harvard, did an extraordinary master's degree there, and then came back to this neck of the woods in our friendly school right down the road, University of North Carolina, and did a brilliant dissertation. About 2 years into her graduate school career, we started to have this sunnah, this model, this tradition, which is the Ilyse paradigm. So if you're a grad student and you wanted to ask your mentors for a letter of recommendation, here's how Ilyse asked for a letter of recommendation. You put together an Ilyse folder and you give it to your advisor so they know how to write for you. You basically tell them, because these grown-ups need help, you tell them what you want them to write for you, and you make it easy for you. And you remind them we had this seminar, I wrote this paper, you gave me back this feedback. Remember? Yes, you do. Now you do, because I just told you. And once Ilyse did it, then other graduate students emulated her. And this pattern of setting a high standard, no short jokes, has been something that she's been embodying in her field. So she's gone from the most extraordinary undergraduate student that I've had in 26 years of teaching to the most extraordinary graduate student that I've had the pleasure of teaching, to now she is directing the field of Islamic Studies at our largest international academy, which is the American Academy of Religion. I think in her third or fourth year, I turned to one of my dear colleagues, Professor Carl Ernst, and said, she will be dean someday. And if she is not, it's only because she has chosen not to become the dean of some university. But she has that kind of a vision, and frankly, many of us would wish for each and every single college and university in America, someone that has both the intellectual, but also the visionary kind of qualities on how to make something like this happen. So it's an extraordinary honor to have Professor Ilyse Morgenstein Fuerst. I think you're in for a treat, for a talk on Islam, on South Asia, on religion, on rebels. Wait, the third one has to start with an R. That's the Bruce Lawrence rule. We need to have some kind of consonants going on here. And resistance. Religion, rebels, and resistance in South Asia, yes. And it's a great joy and pleasure to welcome you back into one of the many places that you call home. And since we're always in the business and the craft of offering you something for you having offered us your presence, shameless plug, I would like to also extend an invitation to anybody who's interested to join us Sunday evening for a free concert, best kind of concert, free concert. You can come to a free concert. You can come to a free concert. You can come and you can bring your friends. A concert of classical Persian music performed by an Iranian musician but sung by a South Asian vocalist to remind us that the category of Persian and Persianate extends far beyond the modern nation-state boundaries of Iran and included many parts of South Asia. So that's at 6 o'clock, right down the quad here at the Richard White Auditorium. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Ilyse Morgenstein Fuerst.
Well, I thought that this was going to be a big feeling talk, and then I got that introduction, so I was exactly right. I don't normally read from a paper, but I'm going to today for 3 reasons. The first is that this is sort of a homecoming for me. I did half of my coursework here. Professor Lawrence was on my dissertation committee. He sweetly brought roses to my defense, and I almost cried in the graduate lounge, but don't tell him I said that. I have known Professor Safi since I was 18 and a first-year college student at Colgate University, and I slithered my way down to UNC so I could continue to work with him. So if I don't keep myself ordered and organized, I think I might feel, to borrow from my mother's lexicon, verklempt, overwhelmed. The other reason is that I wrote a book on this, right? And so there were quite a lot of words in that book, and I don't want to bore you with all of the words that I think you need to know in order to follow the gist. You don't need all of those words, you need the words I wrote, and those are the words I will give you. So I'm going to read and occasionally go extemporaneous, but I'm going to mostly read so that I keep myself on track. And hopefully, and I've practiced this a lot because I was feeling like I was coming home, we have loads of time for Q&A. And so I encourage you to take notes and yell at me in the margins. I'm someone who thinks that the best scholarship is the scholarship that gets hashed out. And so, none of us think in isolation. And so if we can't think together, then I can't think. And selfishly, I did not get on a plane at 4:15 this morning to talk at you and get nothing but a CV line in return. I totally want you to help me think better about these issues. So to start, I owe incredible gratitude to the Duke Islamic Studies Center, Amit Safi, the Franklin Humanities Center, but mostly Julie Maxwell, who has set all of this up, who works in the sidelines, and often these kinds of admin positions, when done well, means that they are done invisibly, but that does not mean that that labor should be made invisible. So thank you, Julie. I'm already over here. I printed out a giant copy of my paper, and now I'm disheveled. Let's start with the formal talk. I don't need any of these pleasantries. So today I am talking about the 1857 to 1858 rebellion in India. And specifically, what I'm going to tell you is that the Great Rebellion was written. How writing it rewrote how Muslim, and I'm putting that in quotes, so when you hear me say that, please hear my air quotes, how Muslim was defined. And spoiler alert, because I teach all undergrads at UVM, and so for me, I always front load the thesis. So here's the thesis. After the rebellion, Muslim and jihadi become elided. The memorialization and writing of rebellion not only marginalized Muslims, but also obscured complex cultures of North India, not by the bisyncretic cultures, but composite ones. The 1857-1858 rebellion called into question literary, social, and religious cultures over and above any political upheaval and the changes sought therein. The rebellion also fundamentally changed what it meant to be a Muslim in North India from the perspective of practicing Muslims. Authorities established the Muslims as a threat. Britons and Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs, as well as others, responded to that definition of threat. So what I'm going to talk about today is how the rebellion marked Muslims as jihadis due to a process of racialization as well as minoritization. And if I do this right, I will, rather quickly perhaps, walk us through how accountings of and responses to the rebellion created a historic discursive shift that sets up racialized patterns we still see today, and what that means as we think about humanities' futures, which was part of my task. In short then, here's my plan. Establish why I think we need a deeper read on the rebellion, think about racialization, minoritization, and Muslims, offer some evidence that the rebellion lingers as a touchstone of racialized religious identities, and finally, conclude with thoughts on how and why my project fits into the broader Humanities Future project here at the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute. There we go. I cannot sequester you all afternoon, despite the air conditioning feeling delightful compared to outside. So here are two premises that I'm happy to discuss more later, but ask that you take as a given. First, that a discursive shift happened. Before the events of 1857, Muslims may have been imagined as violent or warlike, perhaps fanatical, but not in terms of religious obligation. That is to say, authors, European and South Asian alike, though some Persianate and others, do not dwell on the term jihad and its legal obligation in significant ways. However, both immediately and in the decade or so following the rebellion, jihad becomes a central concern for both European and South Asian authors. So our first given is that while stereotypes, for lack of a better term, existed before, these transformed discursively into legally binding, scientifically provable, immutable facts about Muslims. And I hope you hear the sarcasm. I don't know those words. The second given, which is related to the first, is that because of imperialism, flows of power and information, and a simultaneous fixation on race, the shift from stereotype to fact had real global consequences. The second given then is really what today's talk reflects, and to be more on the nose about it, it reflects, or why I care about the rebellion is that it reflects a local and a global history simultaneously. So I want to jump into some audience engagement, right? This is our pseudo-flipped classroom. Let's jump in and examine this image, one that I think sets the tone for my remarks really well. It's Francis Beato's 1858 photograph that documents a mosque in Meerut, a city in the northern Indian state of Uttar Pradesh. This is a simple enough lithograph of an architectural landscape, par for the course in his published lithograph series, which has since been made available through many digital fora. What makes it remarkable is its original title, which suggests it is not merely a mosque, but rather a space for rebels. It reads, if you can't see that, a mosque in Meerut where some of the rebel soldiers may have prayed. A half sentence, one clause, and the mosque and the Muslims who prayed within it are marked in the photograph and in our interpretation 150 some odd years later as part of the religious landscape from which brutal uprisings grew. As far as we know, there is no real evidence for Beatty's caption. There isn't, for example, a log of this particular mosque as one that actually held rebels in East India records, and we have other examples of those. There aren't other supporting eyewitness accounts that corroborate Beatty's insistence, and we have others of those. There aren't South Asian accounts in either Hindi or Urdu or English that suggest this mosque was more than a mosque, or I suppose how you read it, less than a mosque. Beatty's caption itself is less than committal also. It may have been where rebel soldiers prayed. But it's telling because despite its problem, this caption persists. This is the caption that follows this image in all of the secondary literature in English in the past 50 or so years. So by my count, 36 books or articles cite this caption or this image. It is replicated in every iteration of its digital life. It's available via Wiki Commons. It is available via the British Library. It is available via the British Museum, via Hathi Trust, and other digital repositories. Its repetition, availability, and prominence all lend authority to its claims. Beato's Meerut Mosque has become a definitive image of a mosque that may have held not Muslims, but rebels. Lest you think I am a lesser academic, unable to continue to parse a clause ad infinitum, let's keep going. I'm not dwelling because I can, because I'm not a lesser academic, but because the marking of this mosque by a European man, not just as a mosque, but as something more and something more sinister, so neatly encapsulates the ways that writing rebellion, documenting rebellion, memorializing rebellion, wrote, documented, and memorialized Muslim identification. Beato took a photo of a mosque in 1858 and assumed its proximity to one of the earliest and notably bloody revolts of the previous year's war indicated significance, as his caption clearly shows us. He may not have been wrong. Certainly mosques, as well as other sacred sites in North India, were used as shelter during raids and warfare before and after 1857. But whether this particular mosque was used in this particular instance of revolt isn't clear to me or other historians. What is clear is that a photographer and witness to some of the rebellion had no trouble labeling it, classifying it as some sort of mosque come safe haven for the dangerous, seditious Muslim rebels. In other words, this image and its assumed truths tell us what we need to know about religiosity and revolt. They are linked to Islam, and they are linked to the events of rebellion particularly. And it does all of this within the veil of objectivity. This is a European observer's documentary, photographic, and therefore technologically advanced evidence. So we can move on, but this got cut from the book and I'm really excited to share it with you. Okay. So for those unfamiliar with what Beato may have witnessed, 3 days in May of 1857 set off a long and terrifying period of bloodshed, rebellion, suppression, and suspicion. On May 9th, 1857, sepoys, which is derived from Sipahi, Indian soldiers, serving in the 3rd Regiment of Light Cavalry in Meerut, India, awaited imprisonment for failing to use their new weapons properly. The latest Lee-Enfield rifles required sepoys to bind its cartridge in order to load the weapon, but they refused, disobeying direct orders. I can't ever talk about this without getting some like weird narrator voice, because it sounds like a really great story, and it is. They had heard rumors about these new rifles. The cartridges were greased with lard and tallow. Animal products were respectively forbidden Muslim and Hindu soldiers. This was the last straw, supposedly, after months of growing unrest, and these rumors sparked the match that lit a flame of mutiny and rebellion. On May 10th, 1857, as the sepoys of the 3rd Regiment faced their sentencing, other regiments in Beirut broke rank to liberate their imprisoned compatriots forcibly. This was a fierce and bloody internal attack, but the violence was not limited to the garrison walls, and Beirut civilians were not spared. So 20 British and 50 Indian civilians, including really famously women and children, and there's another book on the gendered interpretation of all these documents, we can get there, were massacred. Many sepoys fled to Delhi, some 40 miles away, more or less, during the night, and on May 11th, Delhi too witnessed rebellion. Fighting spread within these 3 days, and a few days after that, to major strongholds cities like Kanpur and Lucknow. So I don't know how visible this is, but I like this map a lot. If you can see it, there are lots of red underlines that show us where fighting broke out. They are clustered in the
There's a laser pointer if you want to use it. There's a laser pointer on the thing.
That's awesome. Yeah, Julie.
I know.
Score. Okay, so in this area, we see the cluster, but notice there are underlines here, over here. This is a pan-Indic set of battles and rebellion. I don't want you to imagine that because I listed 3 cities that those are the only places revolt happened. That would be a pretty limited revolt. These 3 days in 4 cities were just the beginning of a long year and wide area of involvement that continued to mark one of the most important events in South Asian and British history alike, to say nothing of global ramification. While there are many lesser-known examples of Indic resistance to the colonial rule predating 1857, the centrality of this year remains in both Euro-American and South Asian historiographies. Perhaps it has been overvalued as the example of Indian resistance to British rule, but the Great Rebellion is undeniably an exemplar of resistance, and moreover, an indelible set of events which fundamentally altered the ways in which India was ruled, and how Britain saw people and the landscape that they ruled. The events of rebellion, the initial sepoy involvement, its spread to civilians, its multiple massacres on both sides, years of famine and death and retribution that followed, and the brutal ways in which the British regime sought to put down any hint of rebellion in its wake are no doubt enormously significant in size and scope and lasting imprint. We have to take this seriously, in other words. There's also little doubt that the massive imperial reconfiguration in response to rebellion fundamentally alters definition of religion, an issue of vital importance to me, and so to you today. How the rebellion contours notions of religion has serious implications for the study of humanities, and in an attempt to answer some of the prompts Humanities Futures asks, I'll return to these implications at the end of my talk. It is quite simply the case, though, that no scholar of religion can afford to ignore South Asia. Not only have so many of the field's founding thinkers based their theories on Indic languages, literatures, and racial linguistic definitions, I could talk about that for another project I've spent way too much time on. But as others have argued, like Peter Gottschalk, South Asia was the physical and imagined location for the categorization of religion, fundamentally altering how religion is thought about well beyond British rule historically and Indian borders geographically. The rebellion seismically reconfigures the ways in which both religion and also particular religions are defined, characterized, and classified. So we care about 1857 because of British and South Asian history, and we care about it because we care about the history of the study of religion. Or we care about it because you're here and I'm telling you to care about it. Religion as a starting point for rebellion was an omnipresent fascination for Britons in and while discussing South Asia. Religion as a thing, sui generis, intact, whole, to be feared for its power, specifically its power over these uncouth Indian masses. One commentator remarked, "Religion is not a thing to be trifled with, and the dullest and most phlegmatic will be roused to the boiling point of rage and enthusiasm when it is once affected." I think we should all write like 19th century gentlemen. So flowery. But British observers and officials were not equally concerned by all religions. Not all religions appeared to contain the possibility of boiling rage. British observers and officials saw Muslims and Islam as uniquely susceptible to violence due to religious offense, obligation, and sentiment. The rebellion marks a dramatic moment in which Muslims come to be both minoritized and racialized, terms I'm going to get to in just a second. Just as one cannot understand the history of the study of religion without navigating how India has been portrayed, neither can one comprehend a contemporary racialized relationship between Muslims and jihad, I argue, without first locating its historical correlation to the rebellion. So the Great Rebellion and its political repercussions is a discernible moment in the processes of minoritization and racialization, specifically of Indian Muslims. Minoritization should not be confused with a demographic minority, of course. It is instead the systematic process by which elites deny access to a group through an implementation of power broadly defined. Seems simple enough, right? Minoritization is a process, then, in the example of the rebellion, of the consolidation of British power over Muslim elites and the religious constituency they supposedly represent. This was achieved by both de jure and de facto shifts that included, as just like truly the tip of the iceberg examples, discontinuation of Islamic and Indic languages in official settings, real mistreatment of Muslims, like stripping Muslim children from their parents and placing them in schools meant to re-educate them. Minoritization stripped power from those who previously held it, signaling a disenfranchisement, loss of privilege, or a perceived loss of protections. Where minoritization collapses a complex group or groups into a singularity and seeks to marginalize that group, usually in terms of political or social cachet, racialization marks individuals as having immutable traits because of their membership or assumed membership in a particular group. The concept and construct of race includes essentializations of groups based upon traits imagined to be inherent, hereditary, and prognostic. That is to say, it is rooted in pseudobiology and therefore is imagined as scientifically real. Racialization is the process through which individuals are made manifest as both belonging to a cogent group as well as possessing those inherent hereditary and prognostic characteristics. It should sound pretty circular because it is. But religions are not races. Islam is not a race, but Islam and its practitioners are racialized. After the rebellion, Muslims in India are portrayed as inherently seditious, not just potentially warlike, bound by both law and intrinsic disposition to violence, and necessarily ill-tempered, incorrigible, and unable to put up with foreign rule. They are depicted as possessing inherent, unchanging, transmittable characteristics, things that should sound like genetic. These are racialized classifications. Muslims cannot escape these traits. They are imagined to be part of the fundamental composition of what and who is Muslim. To be otherwise, in effect, would indicate that one is not Muslim, an accusation and implication we see often in primary sources and that we will get to in just a minute. Racialization and minoritization do not function solely as external labels thrust upon Europe's or America's others. Instead, they often demand and require the participation of those who have been racialized and minoritized. These are pernicious systems of power, definition, and classification And with respect to Indian Muslims, they relied on stories told about the Great Rebellion. Before the rebellion, Muslims may have been portrayed as violent or prone to fanaticism. And we can talk about those historical antecedents if we need to. But the rebellion triggered definitions of Muslims where religious violence and inheritable fanaticism were absolutely inescapable. The rebellion, as observers wrote, posed a fundamental question about Muslims. Did Muslims belong to or in British India at all? Minoritization and racialization are at the heart of the question of this question about Muslim belonging. In the book that I'm taking all this stuff from, I critically and primarily engaged two authors interested in this question. W.W. Hunter's The Indian Mussulmans, Are They Bound in Conscience to Rebel Against the Queen? Poses an actual question. And over the course of that book, he resoundingly stated that, yup, absolutely, Muslims are bound in conscience to rebel against the Queen, and therefore were a distinct problem to be solved by the British ruling elite. And I hope you're hearing my consistent use of question and problem to be solved. These are not mistaken parallels that I'm trying to draw. While Sir Syed Ahmad Khan had previously written about the rebellion in Causes of the Indian Rebellion, he also responded directly to Hunter in Review on Dr. Hunter's Indian Mussulmans, Are They Bound in Conscience to Rebel Against the Queen? In these pieces, and particularly in the review of Hunter, Khan's defensive writing about the rebellion demonstrates a minoritized and racialized Muslim community, distinctively and uniquely held accountable for the violence of the revolts, regardless of the author's positionality. We're going to talk about that too. This exchange serves to demonstrate discursive minoritization and racialization, how those processes become hegemons against which Muslims too must struggle to be defined. In other words, while Britons asked and demanded answers to the so-called Muslim question, Muslims engaging in this discourse similarly perpetuate the idea that Muslims stand as a unique, cogent group. They thus participate, however asymmetrically, in the processes of definition, racialization, and minoritization. The classification of religions, especially Islam and Hinduism, came to be a hallmark of the British Empire. On the whole, Britons, despite statistical data and often personal lived experience, were convinced of the, quote, essentially religious character of Indians and mutual exclusivity between Hindu and Muslim communities, to cite Gottschalk. The imperial project in India instantiated a classificatory system in which religion was the operative category. The import of this category, the stress on difference between and among Indians on the basis of religion, first and foremost, is most evident during and after 1857. The definition of Indians on the basis of religion reflects British imperial tactics of control, as well as the racialization of the whole population. In this system, religion is not merely some set of beliefs, texts, practices, ideologies. Religion hallmarks a transmittable set of characteristics within families, communities, kinfolk. Defining religion in India was therefore both about the definition of population as well as the demarcation of racialized identifiers. For us, what matters is that Muslims were decidedly not Hindus, partially because of beliefs and practices, but more so because of so-called inborn characteristics. So all of this should sound, I hope, like really basic race theory, because it is. And on top of that, super basic racism. Because it is. Let's return to and expand on these key elements of racialization and religion, and of Islam particularly, within the narrative of the Great Rebellion. Because that's what I'm most interested in. There are countless examples to be had too, so we can go back to Beato's photograph at the very front of this talk, as well as Hunter's quote behind me, for example, or next to me, I should say, for example. But for clarity, I want to focus for the rest of this talk on a salient example, the debate about whether or not jihad was permitted against the British. More specifically, I want to focus on what came to be known as the Calcutta Fatwa, a ruling that declared jihad was not permissible, that the British but that British observers routinely either dismissed, or what I see as worst, somehow used as evidence that even if a few Muslims could prove themselves, the masses could not because of inborn and prognostic characteristics. The Calcutta Fatwa came to represent the opposite of what it stated. Muslims were bound and altogether likely to rebel against the Queen, Hunter argued. And I argue because of the logics of racialization and minoritization. In November of 1870, in response to inflammatory newspaper articles, ongoing and persistent accusations of sedition, and what was written of as a general climate of suspicion, the Mohammedan Literary Society of Calcutta asked Maulvi Karmat Ali, a Hanafi jurist, to offer a ruling on whether Muslims were required by religious law to rebel against the Queen. Excuse me. The Mohammedan Literary Society was an elite group of Muslims, and its founder, that gentleman over there, and its host of the November 1870 meeting, Maulvi Abdul Latif, was a noted intellectual, known as a modernizer, and a well-respected man within both Muslim and British circles, and I think that's a key point for us here. Ali ruled that, quote, according to Mohammedan law, British India is Darul Islam, and that it is not lawful for the Mohammedans of British India to make jihad, end quote. He added that, quote, ignorant Mohammedans had dared to pose the question, and he only answered it at some insistence by the Mohammedan Literary Society because of their repute. Despite rejecting the question out of hand, and I mean the second sentence, he's like, Bismillah, great, this is stupid. You're all ignorant for asking this question. I mean, it's like an instant dismissal. So he dismisses it out of hand, but then he goes on to outline why the threshold for jihad had not been met. So one gets the sense that he's writing not just for his Muslim audience, but for others as well. Hunter, writing the very next year, was well aware of this particular ruling. It was published as a pamphlet in both Urdu and English simultaneously, and it was one of but a few that had been issued around and in the decade following rebellion. Hunter addressed the Calcutta Fatwa directly. One would think that a group loyal to the British, some of the members of the Mohammedan Literary Society had fought on behalf of the British during the rebellion. So one would think that their offering of a solid and official ruling supporting British rule in India would be welcomed, maybe even heralded. Listeners, it was not. Instead, Hunter in particular, though I can cite other folks here, argued, quote, it would be political blunder for us to accept without inquiry the views of the Mohammedan Literary Society of Calcutta as those of the Indian Muslimans. So let's unpack this a bit. Because while Hunter went on and on about this fatwa and the ways in which it was incorrect, I believe something like 70 or 80 pages of his book are dedicated to this fatwa. This particular line, and especially that clause, as those of the Indian Muslimans, helps us get at the heart of what I'm trying to show you about racialization and minoritization. The Mohammedan Literary Society conducted public meetings, usually in Urdu, but with some regularity in English, to discuss a great range of literatures in Urdu, Persian, Arabic, and English predominantly. Its membership was necessarily elite. Literate, of course, of great financial means, often with deep connections to multiple streams of power in northern India in the mid-19th century, which is to say, connections to Mughal rule, current connections or lingering connections to the East India Company, possible connections to the ulama, sometimes members of the ulama were members of this group as well. We all know those boundaries are fuzzy. Many ties to Calcuttan financial, political, and social elite structures. These are elites. Despite many being noted supporters of the British regime, despite some fighting for the British during the rebellion, Hunter flatly dismisses the Calcutta ruling entirely. first by attacking the legitimacy of its claims, but later, and in this line behind me, by suggesting it folly to conflate this society of learned Muslim men with Indian Muslims writ large. He implies here, and later states, that elite Muslims are decidedly not real Muslims. They are not Indian Muslims. For Hunter, Indian Muslims are zealous and violent by nature. The fanatical masses, as he refers to them consistently throughout the text, well over 100 times that phrase occurs. Searchable PDFs are the best, right? The fanatical masses will pay no mind to the Mohammedan Literary Society or its fatwa. In a clause, elite, learned, loyal Muslims, the Muslims who clearly see themselves as respectable answers to the so-called Muslim question, are dismissed as fundamentally not quite Muslim enough. To be Muslim, in Hunter's view, is to be seditious. Evidence to the contrary doesn't stand to prove that Muslims are loyal, but rather that those folks are simply less Muslim, perhaps not Muslim at all, or, as Professor Safi usually says in class, diet Muslim. And so this fatwa, sought as a salve to an untenable political climate post-rebellion, instead renders its seekers something other than what they started, not Muslim at all. And moreover, in Hunter's argument, their inherent untrustworthiness, that they seem to be Muslims but in fact cannot represent Muslims at all, actually upholds the racialized system he's established. So here's what I mean. Forgive the lengthy quote. I'll read it to you. It's there. I'm obviously most excited by the stuff that's in italics and green. So he investigates the zealotry, the effects of zealotry on the masses. So he writes, I propose, therefore, to scrutinize the Sunni decisions with a view to ascertaining the effect which they will have on more zealous Mohammedans, men with whom the sense of religious duty is the rule of life, and whose minds are uninfluenced either by fear or danger or by habits of prosperous ease. For it is no use shutting our eyes to the fact that a larger proportion of our Mohammedan subjects belong to this class. The majority of Muslims are fanatics, period. Their religious duties, he argues, rule their lives unencumbered by fear or danger or even prosperity, which is how he questioned the motives and authenticity of elite Muslims who procured a ruling that appeared to favor British rule. Favorable ruling aside, their elite status, their so-called prosperous ease, does not guard against the inherent zealotry of their co-religionists. It stands to reason that should these elites lose their elite status, should they lose prosperity, they should also regain religious and seditious zealotry. The Mohammedan Literary Society played a willing role in carving definitions of authentic Islam. They, perhaps unwillingly, attempted to demonstrate real Islam, and those were used in ways they couldn't have anticipated, ways that solidified the very racialized image they were working against. Similarly, I have found Sir Syed Ahmad Khan to fill this kind of space, and is thus an ideal subject of examination. That he stridently disagreed with Hunter may not surprise us, but Khan's writing is all the more fascinating and noteworthy for Hunter's argument that people like Khan, loyalist, modernist, supposedly reasonable, might not exist at all. Or according to Hunter, if such Muslims existed, they merely inhabited such a minoritized class of Muslims to be inconsequential. Hunter expressly denied the veracity of the very proof text Khan relied upon. Their debate, these writings back and forth, may well be seen as a one-sided argument where Hunter sets the parameters and Khan merely participates within those boundaries. His reply, Sir Syed's reply, however, echoed in certain communities, English and Indian, Christian and Muslim, to say nothing of their ramifications in Hindu and Sikh communities. Khan did more than participate in a discourse central to the questions of Muslims' identity and loyalty. He helped shape it. His response to Hunter's impactful monograph illustrates that he and others were challenging depictions of jihad as solely representing their identity, persons of faith, racially identified subjects, and as members of a loyal, though increasingly political milieu. His most withering critique was reserved for Hunter's assertion that Muslims ought to be understood as seditious and disloyal. He did not like this. He included a lengthy quote in the review in which Hunter claimed that fanatical Muslims, the fanatical masses, had engaged in overt sedition, and the, quote, whole Mohammedan community has been openly deliberating their obligation to rebel for some time, end quote. So Khan cites that Hunter quote and follows with an admonishment where he retorts, I have no hesitation in saying that this is one of the most unjust, illiberal, and insulting sentences ever penned against my co-religionist. So I don't want you to hear me saying that Khan is agreeing with Hunter. He's merely playing the game that Hunter has set up. His analysis of Hunter's inferences about the rebellion centered on Hunter's misread of plurality, nuance, and what we might call today diversity in belief, population, legal matters, you name it. Khan ably punctured Hunter's argument of totality, which despite Hunter's careful research typifies the conclusions of Indian Muslimans. The Muslims he envisioned and produced in that work were categorically and definitionally treasonous, seditious, and suspect. So he wins the argument, and yet. He also has lines like this peppered throughout his work, particularly the review. Quote, it is not to be expected that Mohammedans, who are made of much sterner material than Hindus, will adapt themselves so readily to the various phases of this changing age. So like Hunter, Sir Syed saw Muslims as a distinctive group with categorical identity traits, stern, or at least sterner than Hindu counterparts. Khan saw his fellow Muslims as naturally less willing or able to adapt to British rule. There are many more examples to be had, and I promised you I would not read you the entirety of my book, so I won't. But I want to take a breath for a moment and restate the point of all these kind of primary source quotes. Sir Syed stands to demonstrate that the sort of Muslim Hunter believes to be decidedly unrepresentative of the fanatical masses is, in fact, Muslim and Indian. Right? So far, so good. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, Muslim and Indian, trying to claim that he is. We also know that Khan systemically, point by point, undoes Hunter's argument. We here have a voice that is at once playing into a certain respectability politic, while offering well-read criticism of a major British figure and his widely held, widely trusted, and widely circulated pronouncements. But we're still left with the process of minoritization and racialization, which Khan does not and cannot escape both as an individual and as an author. He is minoritized precisely because while he might have experienced a more powerful position years prior, or men like him may have, he is already arguing from a defensive, apologetic position. He finds himself without the same status, even as he maintains a significant and lasting position of power. Second, he is both racialized and participates in racialization, because after 1857, an imperial understanding of jihad linked and reduced Muslim actors and Muslim organizations to rebellion and violence, forcing them to consistently comment on issues like jihad. They both deployed jihad in ways that encapsulate the battle to define post-rebellion South Asian landscape, most relevantly to us, definitions of Muslims and Islam. And as such, Hunter and Khan participate in a discourse that served to produce Muslims as minoritized and racialized, even if they disagree with each other. So, at long last, let's get to the point of all of this. The rebellion matters on a global scale, not because I'm telling you it mattered, or because I'm hoping that this event seems big because of bloodshed, but because at the time it was truly a sensationalized event that captured a global imagination. It signaled a previously unthought possibility of massive loss, not, as in the case of the United States, by one white Christian army comprised of defectors and long-standing political enemies, but of the colonized. High atop this list of terrifying circumstances was the notion of a realized Muslim enemy, a Muslim world, something that I think I saw Jamil Eaton's has written brilliantly about. A realized Muslim world order was a thing in which Indians could participate, could even lead, receive funding from, and most alarmingly, rally other Muslims to overthrow the British in their hometowns. Hunter's text supposedly addressed Indian Muslimans. His title says it, but it's riddled with so-called evidence from everywhere and anywhere else, ranging from the Arabian Peninsula to Persia to North Africa to the Afghan borderlands to the Indian subcontinent. Hunter, in linking Indian Muslimans to the rest of the Muslim world, is making an argument about Muslims broadly. Khan replies in kind. A global set of evidences to prove the global identity and character of Indian Muslims belies both a fear and an implicit calling upon some sort of universal or universalized Muslim, or at least a universally accessible Muslim world. These terms and characteristics, jihad, trustworthiness, ability to belong to a nation state, Muslim world, still carry meaning. We still use them, and they still informed racialized understanding of Muslims. So part of my charge when I told the Humanities Center I would come was to think critically about humanities' futures, or perhaps to rethink this work I have already done within the framework of futurity. So I have two thoughts, and I hope you'll pick up on some of these threads later. I don't know how well baked they are. That didn't make sense. I don't know how well they are. But first, an easy one. How we imagine and remember the past are integral to how we imagine and chart our futures. Can we hear echoes of the rebellion in how we tie violence to Islam? Imagine Muslims as a cogent whole. Talk of some sort of universal Muslim or Muslim world across divides of language, nationality, ethnicity, race, geography, ritual, theological practice, gender identity, class, ability, what I miss. Can we imagine how the fact that Muslims are racialized is real, dangerous, omnipresent reality in 2018? And can we imagine that that might be related to essays penned in the aftermath of one of the 19th century's most important, bloody, anti-colonial movements? Can we envision how not teaching this event in American or Canadian, I checked, curricula feeds into still unfolding ideas about Indians and Indian Muslims? Can we imagine how the politics of renaming the rebellion a mutiny, as it is still taught in England, or the First War of Independence, as it is currently taught in India, refigures not just the past, but the future of those nation states? Thinking about how we got here and where this trajectory could lead is the unique task and promise, I think, of humanities scholarship. We cannot draw a line of causation from rebellion and racializations that happened during rebellion to today, but we absolutely can historicize, contextualize, and theorize the rhetorical similarities we see between these myriad arenas. Okay, the second thought I have regarding futurity is that disciplinary thought doesn't get us to any answers. So as a scholar of religion, like many scholars of religion, I claim my training is decidedly without discipline. Religion is a field, not a discipline, which means it is interdisciplinary by nature. If interdisciplinarity is a feature of humanities' futures, and I think that it is, but also so does the website Humanities Futures, then religion and its study has to be a feature of this futurity model. Here's how. The Great Rebellion is a catalyst for the minoritization and racialization of Muslims, and in its wake, Muslims in India emerge permanently differentiated as a result of the epistemological and physical violences of imperialism. But we should not assume that because the Great Rebellion ended in 1858/1859, that its effects are limited to the past. As I mentioned, no scholar of religion should ignore South Asia in her thinking about how the study of religion has come to be. And similarly, no scholar of religion ought to ignore that the role of rebellion continues to play in some of our contemporary imaginations of nation states, religious bodies, imperialism, post-colonialism. The Great Rebellion actively looms in Indian conceptualizations of history and national identity. So in May of 2007, India celebrated the 150th anniversary of the Great Rebellion, or rather, as it was memorialized then, India's First War of Independence. Celebrations included performances, marches in multiple cities, something like 50,000 strong, art, historical reflection, op-eds in newspapers, and my very personal favorite, this float. This is a parade float, and if you can't read the caption, it says, the British were represented by a giant floating ghoul.
Wow.
I'm just gonna let that sit for a minute. It's excellent. Naming, as you might expect, is political. The marking of the sesquicentennial of the rebellion in terms of the First War of Independence allowed many, including then Prime Minister Singh, to gloss the rebellion as evidence of a unifying, multi-religious India. Such a rhetorical move is political. In his reflection on the 150th commemoration, renowned historian and theorist Dipesh Chakrabarty explored the politics of remembering these acts of revolt. He suggested that commemorations display a tension between celebrating a recurring date in the life of a nation and that date's representation of a, quote, perpetual incitement to future rebellion. He argues, and I think it's fruitful for us to think about this, that it is an event that is celebrated and eulogized, but it is important because of the way it is imagined and reinscribed. Eulogizing it makes it practical and real for people. I would add to this, it matters in terms of how it's deployed. So in May of 2015, for example, the northern Indian state of Haryana announced that it would establish a memorial to the martyrs of the 1857 mutiny at Ambala Cantonment. Ambala, I tried to put a map up there for you, like Meerut, Delhi, Kanpur, this was an important British stronghold, and there is still a cantonment section of the city today, and there are still, I believe, Air Force bases there. It's a major site of rebellion. So the Indian state gets together, they establish a memorial, and to do so, they perform a Bhumi Puja, a groundbreaking ceremony. Government officials laid the foundation stone on May 11th, which you may remember from the very beginning of this talk as one of the first days remembered as the start of the rebellion. The Hindu, one of India's major English language newspapers, reported that Haryana's Health, Sports, and Youth Affairs Minister, I don't know why this was the gentleman in charge, but there you have it, Anil Vij, said that establishing this memorial to the martyrs was historic and, quote, future generations would always remember the present government for this important step, end quote. So the government of Haryana built a memorial to the martyrs of the Great Rebellion that died in its state, timed its foundation to the calendaric occurrence of the first revolts, and offered a largely Hindu ceremonial groundbreaking. These are all examples of Chakrabarty's assertion that the memorialization of the rebellion is a lasting, impactful force in contemporary India. And as Minister Vij suggested, the memorialization of the Great Rebellion aimed to serve a dual purpose here. It would commemorate those lost in the revolts, sure, but it would additionally commit the contemporary government, him, to the popular memory as well. This government, his government, would be remembered for properly memorializing the Great Rebellion. So a minute on this Bhumi Puja. It's a ceremony that ritually blesses the ground, or earth bhumi, and is a classical Sanskritic source in the Vastu Sastra, a Hindu system of architecture. It's important to note the ways in which the government cast those who died in the earliest part of the revolt as martyrs for India, the First War of Independence, and the ceremony to establish that memorial was cast in specifically religious terminologies. This was not a secular ceremony, marking the martyrs and those remembering them as Hindu. Religion here is deployed in fascinating ways. It marks a physical memorial, it marks those memorialized, it marks the cause, it marks the current political state, Haryana and India. Religion, and here the religion of Hindus, is constructed in this example as the religion of rebels, rebellion, current and future Haryana citizenry. Muslims are noticeably, and I would say problematically, absent. We know that Muslims were killed alongside Hindus and Sikhs at Ambala, and we know that demographically speaking, Muslims and Sikhs account for today about 16% of the city. We might rightly expect higher numbers pre-partition, to say nothing of the mid-19th century. The portrayal of rebels as martyrs and as distinctively Hindu is a flip, perhaps, from the portrayal of rebels as distinctively and disturbingly Muslim. We can credit Hindu nationalism here, and we can go into all the citations of that, but that's a little bit tangential. What's relevant is that excluding Muslims in our contemporary era is just as racialized a reading as uniquely finding them culpable in the mid-19th century. Both are iterations of this Muslims are not Hindus and someone is responsible uniquely. They are both iterations of racialized belonging. The rebellion mobilized the Muslims as a category and in turn the Hindus as well. In Haryana, the state government recently memorialized the Great Rebellion in these Hindu vernaculars. But I think it's possible because the Muslims, a British imperial category, lingers in this memorialization regardless of who deployed it. The Great Rebellion served to homogenize and define two primarily and imperial-controlled religious groups of India. We'll move to this. So, eminent historian Peter Hardy quipped that for British observers in 1857, a Muslim meant a rebel. But that sensibility was not confined to 19th century observers. Those who wrote about the rebellion wrote its legacy, and in the process, wrote Muslims as jihadi, inherently treasonous subjects to be controlled, surveilled, and suspected. Islam is not a race, religions are not races, but Muslims are racialized in meaningful, lasting ways after the rebellion. There are many routes of definition and routes that those definitions take, and it is clear that the solidification of power by the British over India in the wake of the Great Rebellion is both one of those routes and routes of the racialization of Muslims. That's it. Okay, I suppose I will moderate questions. Does anyone have any?
I think you are, but so I was wondering what the Hindus in the period 1857 and that period thinking about the Muslims. Was there a form of racialization that was taking place on the side of the Hindus who were the Muslims?
Yeah, so that was, did everybody hear that question? What were Hindu participation and racialization of Muslims? Does that make sense? Is that fair?
Yeah.
So I necessarily focused on Muslims and Britons, but in the folks I read that were either identifying themselves as Hindu or as identified as Hindu by British observers, so there were a lot of like pseudo-ethnographies. Folks would interview folks and then write about it. And I will give a sidebar on why sometimes it's a little hard with respect to the rebellion to identify Hindu observers, because there was a particular trend. I want to sidebar that, I'll come to it. Many Hindus were adamant to not be erased in their own rebellious actions. So a lot of the Hindus that I read were sort of irritated, particularly after 1859. So like newspapers in the 1860s, I would say, that Hindus were responding to the idea that Muslims were uniquely culpable for the rebellion as like, excuse me, I also rebelled. Please do not erase my anti-imperial feelings. I'm super rebellious. Others, I would say that was the majority, at least in the 1860s. I would say other responses included jumping on the bandwagon. Yep, those Muslims, they're rebel rousers. We're not, we're really friendly. Hire us, right? Because in certain states, Hindus had something to gain by a minoritization of Muslims. It meant that more Hindu possibilities for roles within a British government existed. But for the most part, I actually saw more Hindu responses that were annoyed by their own erasure in the rebellion than not. And those texts, and this is not my project, but those texts were picked up in some ways later by folks that were articulating 1857 as the first war of Indian independence and uniquely Hindu. because you can pick up on that. But I want to come back to that thing I bracketed. So there was a trend right around the rebellion of British authors taking up Bengali names in particular, claiming that they were random Bengalis, and then writing that they had translated work, and articulating a pro-British vantage point and an anti-Muslim vantage point in the voice of Hindus, but like we know it was just you, guy named Malcolm. Seriously, a guy named Malcolm Lewin wrote like a lot of these. And he would pick another name that sounded Hindu. And he would often put a title that was like Swami, or, if you can imagine deeply inappropriate maneuverings. So so I actually think there's a really interesting and strange gap in some of, because I was looking at popular sources, so newspapers, things that got some traction, not just single monographs or manuscripts, but things that were serialized and widely distributed. And a lot of the things that purported to be written by Hindus, you could find if you traced it, that it was actually either written by an Englishman or suspected to be written by an Englishman in the guise of a Hindu. And again, that for me proves this kind of whose racialization is beneficial to the British and whose is not. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there was no Hindu voice.
Not in the records that I was looking at, though I assume, and I don't read in Bengali, I assume quite a lot of writing in Bengali happened at that time. The stuff that I was reading from Calcutta was usually in Urdu or in English, and or in translation from Bengali, so there's a lack in terms of my ability to answer your question, because I don't read that language. But from what I gather, this was a conversation really by Britons about Muslims and occasionally using Hindus as a prop. Yeah, troubling. Go ahead.
I've read about the first independence war in the history textbooks. After that, I didn't study history. So one figure comes again and again, is the name Mangal Pandey.
Mm-hmm.
So he's the one who was credited with starting the revolution. And there are stories, and there's a Bollywood film by Amir Khan on that. So in India, the narration is, you're very right that Muslims are not given are sort of invisibilized or forgotten in the first war of independence. But in the popular, or at least in the formal history textbooks, it is seen as a Hindu fight against the British. And the current government, actually, what you said was the previous government, saying that it's a symbol of unity. But I think the current government are trying to appropriate that as a Hindu fight against the British. So I don't know why you didn't mention the figure of Mangal Pandey in this. Was it deliberate or?
I couldn't get to everything. But yeah, I think what's interesting about the comparison between Pakistan, when you write a thing, it needs to be limited. So my ability to say all the things that I researched was not perfect. But I did look at some Indian textbooks and some Pakistani textbooks, and Pakistani textbooks seem to teach it as not India, nation-state of India's first war of independence, but as the first, act of resistance and self-governance. So not in the same terminologies, but certainly with the same spirit, though locating the heroes as precursors to a Pakistani nation-state. So there's like a whole other project there. In the British accounting of who the heroes or the starters of the rebellion are, they did a really good job of picking one of everybody that they thought was a threat. So there are stories about Pandi, there are stories about like various Muslim leaders in different locales, and then there's a couple of stories of Sikh warriors. So it kind of depended where British observers were, but in the formal historical accounts, you see this like, all of the religions were represented, but the Muslims were the scariest in the British accounting of it. And then I think how folks tell those stories today tells us a lot about contemporary politics, and possibly not that much about historical events. Or something about historical events, but not as much as it tells us about contemporary politics. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. This was really fascinating. I've got two questions. One, do you see any sources that you looked at more fluidity between categories of Islam and Hinduism before the rebellion? And two, why do you think that Muslims uniquely were kind of singled out to be racialized? Do you think it had to do with maybe like the threat of Mughal Empire and that kind of like connection waning, or was just sort of like whatever was most convenient for British Empire?
Yeah, I think absolutely the Mughal Empire is part of it, right? Because it's not, I think that what's going on here is not as simple as just racialization or just minoritization. It is both you need the folks who had power to lose that power. That's a process of minoritization. And one of the ways you can do that is via racialization. And also that's like en vogue in the mid-19th century, right? And I say that tongue-in-cheek, but with full acknowledgement of how scary that is. Scientific racism hits its stride in these colonies and at this historical moment. And so the ability to talk about being Muslim as prognostic. So Hunter has this whole section, and honestly I didn't include it in this talk because it is just depressing to talk about in public, but it's in the book. You should get it from the library, it's too expensive to buy. There's a whole section that Hunter's like, how do we solve the problem of Muslims? Re-educate their children. If you re-educate their children, you will make them less Muslim. That will not solve the problem, because as long as Muslims are having Muslim babies, they will be Muslims, but you might be able to get out of some of it. It was like eugenics, right? And the eugenics movement is later, so like don't misread my history, but that kind of scientific racism about families, about racial groups being tied to things that encompass all sorts of ethnicities, classes, language groups, identities, you name it, being homogenized into one thing, and then that thing being prognostic and inheritable is in fashion in the 19th century. So I think that those things work together. So obviously history informs this, right? The imagination of Hindus as weaker, effeminate, sleepy, lazy, all of those things affect how the British see them and where they put their concerns. So I'm not suggesting, and I hope I made this clear, one of my givens was, stereotypes exist before 1857, but how they localize after it and how they become mobilized after it is a real shift. And it really is an overnight thing. Before 1857, we just don't see this tying to obligation to violence. We might see more violent than. And that might sound like I'm splitting hairs, but I'm not sure I am when we're talking about a fundamental shift in legal and government structure. Did that answer your question? Oh, and the first part, was there more fluidity in definition? I did not study that in this project, and I don't think so. I think these groups were pretty solid, including the Sufis, who were, for Hunter, not Muslim but Hindu, following other scholars of these things. So in that way, I guess that's fluid, because that's bonkers. But in other research, in the early 19th century, certainly, British observers had a much more fluid. But by the middle of the 19th century, and certainly the latter quarter of the 19th century, when Hunter is reflecting on the rebellion, these are pretty standard. He knows what he means by Muslims. And there's a really fascinating part where he uses Muslim and Wahhabi interchangeably for like 40 pages straight. Yeah, it's wacky text. Go ahead, hi, Salwa.
Hey, so I would like for you to elaborate a little bit more on this British criticism of the Kolkata fatwa and then not representative of the true Muslim. Because in some ways, this highly problematic talk is still right twice a day. And this is a question that gets taken up, right, by scholars of post-colonialism and subaltern studies. So I'd like to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, it's an awesome question. So the way that the British, and here I'm thinking of Hunter, a guy named Carey, and a couple other dudes, they all were really excited about the Calcutta fatwa, which again, to remind you, this group solicits a fatwa. Is jihad legal? They're like, absolutely not. You have to follow the British. And the British, more or less, are like, whatever, your group is irrelevant, it does not matter what you say. And the way that they frame it, or the way that they, I think that the way they get away with it is that, so Hunter has in a different part of his book that even friendly Muslims, because Muslims are inherently seditious, they only seem friendly and they only think they are capable of being friends, but watch out. And he starts to cite things that I think are sort of interesting, to put it mildly, like connections to money sources. So there's like this vast global conspiracy that at any moment Muslims who are wealthy, who lose their wealth because of the British, could get wealth from other rich Muslims elsewhere. He is deeply concerned that these elite Muslims, because they are elite, need to be placated but can't be trusted. And talks about how because they have access to their own wealth, because they have access to these global money systems, they could just raise an army at any moment, and that's a real threat. The other ways that it gets written is that Hunter, like any good white armchair Christian cis-het British historian of the 19th century, does this thing where he's like, that's cool, Hanafi jurist, that's cool that you read these texts in this way. Let me show you how I would read them, and then tell you how you've misread them. So he just fundamentally does not trust Muslims as being capable of making their own decisions, but then paradoxically relies on Muslim sources throughout his text to prove his very point. It's just that he puts himself as the final arbiter of Islamic truth. He takes all of these rulings from, like often, what is now the Saudi spaces, or the Arabian Peninsula, or North Africa, or Iran, like Persia. And he says, these were used in these ways, and here's how they could be used against us, and will. And despite Muslims saying opposite, he's like, yeah, but other Muslims wrote this, and I know the truth. So I appreciate your furrowed brow, because I also don't really know how this makes sense, except that there's a circular logic here of the perniciousness of racialization. If you are not smart enough to know about yourself, then it doesn't matter what you say. Hunter is always in charge. He is always the mediator here. And I'm using him as the example, but this is true for all of the white dudes I read. That's an unsatisfying answer, but did that help?
It does. Let's talk about it more.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So, my question, I'm Sajjad. My question is, so there is so much racialization of Indian Muslims, but is also there any kind of exceptionalism for like Sajjan Muslims, as Al-Islam does it for example, Iranian Shias? I'm saying they are Aryans, so they might be doing something. So is there any kind of radicalization within the Muslims in the subcontinent?
No. At least in Hunter's texts, like Hunter is, so the preamble to this book is one of the best things ever. It's just great. It's like, you should read this paragraph. It's on Hati Trust, I think. It's great. He's like, everybody, here's the introduction to the second edition. Some of you have critiqued me by saying this is an official report because the viceroy made me write it. It's not. Just because the guy in charge made me write it doesn't mean it's official. And then he goes on to say, as a friend to Indian Muslimans, I find it is my duty to tell you all about them. Which is why Syed Ahmed Khan writes in response, and he's like, some friend? Literally, he's like, a friend to us may you never be, or something, like something bombastic in 19th century that I'm butchering now because I'm tired. Hunter doesn't really have an exception. He writes in other places. He lived in what was then the very large state of Bengal. He lived there for many years, and he writes things like, I have friends that are Bengali, and I love them dearly. But on the whole, you can't trust the Muslims, right? And I'm being snarky, but he does not make exceptions. He is really worried about Shi'is, and he is grateful that they do not exist in great number in South Asia. He is terrified of Wahhabi Muslims, but thinks they are the truth tellers. He calls them Protestants in a number of places. But he doesn't differentiate between these groups. And it's one of the things that frustrates Khan a lot. Khan says, there's differences. You've lived here. You wrote the Gazetteer. You've done the demographic labor, friend. And yet you don't get it. I think this is the last one, right?
Wow, what an honor. Thank you so much for your talk. And my question, you have probably alluded to the answer to this question a little bit in many of your answers previously, but I just wondered if you could situate this event and the writings that you reviewed a little bit more explicitly in terms of the rise of the social sciences as a global knowledge formation, and ideas about scientific racism. And if you think that what you see happening in this kind of pivot point with this rebellion, if there are parallel styles of thinking or understandings about other kinds of peoples or other kinds of differences in colonial contexts elsewhere, because it just seems to me that this is a moment also where certain biologically inflected thinkings about race become really solidified and hardened. So I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm probably not going to do it justice because it's a big question. So first, a citation, because I'm used to assigning homework. I think you should read Gottschalk's Religion, Science, and Empire. He does a whole thing on scientism and the ways in which the mid-19th century sets up science as an ideology from which you cannot escape. And so when all things become refracted through that light, you start to see the British testing that theory out, particularly in India, and then testing it out in other locales. And India for the British is really important because it's their largest holding, right? In terms of the rise of social sciences, absolutely. So Hunter writes the Indian Gazetteer. This is a major document. It is meant to be at once an atlas. There's all sorts of cartography that happens in there. At once demography. There's, depending on the issue you read, there's some surveys that you're just kind of why did you need to know how many cows people owned in this state, right? And there's census data published in some of these. So the accounting for and classifying is absolutely part of at least Hunter's worldview. So I would probably call him, if not a social scientist, then a proto-social scientist. Because the sorts of data he is working with look like data. He's also using texts, but he's mostly excited about those kinds of data. Not in this text, but in things he's famous for, things he's knighted for, if that makes sense. So I don't know that we can talk about this work without talking about the rise of disciplinary thinking, the rise of academics, and the rise of things like social sciences, ethnography, anthropology, going there to learn things. In terms of how it was applied, I don't know if this is a direct answer, but I know that in 1867, maybe 1869, there's a really great parliamentary record that they've questioned folks that were living in India. And they start talking about how they need to prevent rebellion and rebellion-like things that happened in India. What is the data that they have? what do we know about the rebellion, and how do we prevent it from happening elsewhere, particularly in Muslim-majority countries. So they're really worried about it in the mid-1860s, which is one of the reasons that he's commissioned to write this in 1870. Like, it is a direct response to these questions. So I do not know how they were deployed in other places, but I know that that was part of the global imperial thinking, that we can learn lessons about this thing over here, and absolutely it affects other places elsewhere. Okay, I think we're out of time. Thanks everybody for coming, it was really great.